Welcome to the deep dive. It's Christmas Day, and if you're tuning in, you're clearly looking to cut through some of the holiday noise.
And that's exactly what we're here to do.
We've taken a whole stack of sources from a single day's paper, and our mission is, well, it's pretty simple. Translate all that high-stakes geopolitical and economic material into a clear analytical digest for you.
Right, we're not just reading headlines. We're trying to distill the core economic logic behind them. Who benefited, who lost, and why these shifts in markets and state power really mattered to your wallet.
And we've zeroed in on three big themes from the back half of 2025. First, there's this weird paradox in the U.S. economy, this massive AI boom.
While everyone else feels the pinch.
Exactly. Second, there's a systemic campaign, both political and corporate, being waged against institutions that, well, that provide objective knowledge. Science, journalism.
And finally, the ongoing high-stakes power struggles. China, the U.S., Russia, Ukraine, all of that.
So let's start with that first one, the big economic paradox. We're calling it the Great Economic Disconnect of 2025.
It's the perfect way to frame it. Because on paper, I mean, the numbers look fantastic. GDP growth was really robust.
The markets.
Markets flew. The S&P 500, the Dow, they closed out the year with gains over 15%.
15%. Yet the feeling on the ground is just grim. I saw a number that said 74% of Americans think the economy is only fair or poor.
74%. That massive gap, that disconnect between the financial data and how people actually feel, that's the real story of the year.
So where's the disconnect coming from?
Well, the sources point to one very, very specific cause: artificial intelligence. The growth wasn't coming from everywhere. It wasn't broad-based at all. It was almost entirely concentrated in huge capital investments. We're talking data centers, high-end chips, all the infrastructure for AI.
And this is where it really matters for you, the listener, trying to understand your own economic situation. The sheer scale of that spending, I mean, it was enormous.
It was so enormous that some estimates suggest that AI spending alone accounted for almost half, nearly half of the entire U.S. GDP growth in 2025.
That is just a staggering number.
It is. And it's a specific kind of growth. It's capital expenditure, not labor income. So it benefits tech investors, shareholders, the contractors building the data centers.
But it doesn't really trickle down.
It doesn't flow into the average household. It's not raising wages across the board or lowering the price of everyday goods.
And that's the crucial part, isn't it? The daily lived experience, the things you have to buy, groceries, housing, healthcare, those costs are climbing much faster than the overall inflation numbers would suggest.
Exactly. So if the AI boom isn't making your rent or your groceries cheaper, that 15% market return feels, well, it feels totally abstract. It's happening somewhere else to someone else.
Which perfectly explains the negative sentiment. The gains are just so highly concentrated at the very top.
And we can actually connect this whole economic picture to another huge story from this year: tariffs.
Right. The rhetoric was intense. A sweeping 25% tariff on everything. Analysts were predicting, what, a global trade crash, a massive inflation spike.
Total panic in the markets. Everyone expected the worst.
But that disaster just never happened. Why not? Why didn't we see that global contraction?
Well, it's because there was this huge gap between the political announcement and the economic reality.
Yeah.
The announced rate was 25%, but the actual realized aggregate rate as of November, it was closer to 9%.
9. So much lower.
Much lower.
Yeah.
Now, the government was still collecting a lot of money, about $25 billion a month in tariff revenue, but you have to put that number in context.
$25 billion a month is not nothing. That's a huge tax on trade.
It is, but you have to compare it to the size of the whole U.S. economy. That $25 billion a month, so $300 billion a year. You put that up against a $31 trillion U.S. GDP.
It's a drop in the bucket.
One source literally called them rounding errors. They were big enough to cause some friction, some price hikes, in specific sectors. But they weren't big enough to derail the whole system.
Especially with that massive AI boom happening at the same time, acting as a kind of buffer.
Exactly. The AI boom built a floor under the economy, and the tariffs ended up having less economic bite than their political bark.
Okay, that makes sense. So that covers the money. Let's shift gears. Let's talk about the state of our foundational knowledge. Accountability.
Yeah, and this might be the most concerning theme we found. It really gets at the reliability of the institutions you count on for information.
You're talking about the war on science.
A very specific, politically motivated war on institutional science. It's being framed as an economic policy, for grid stability, or to dismantle what the administration calls the green energy scam.
But the real-world impact is, it's just devastating. They're systematically cutting funding and staff, getting rid of these highly specialized federal scientists.
Across agencies you really depend on, like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, which gives us our weather and climate data, and of course the EPA.
And what's the mechanism here? How are they pushing people out?
A lot of the pressure is coming from the Elon Musk-led U.S. DOGE service. It's driving policies designed to cut hundreds of thousands of federal jobs.
And specifically targeting certain kinds of jobs.
Specifically, people working in regulatory enforcement or climate research. This isn't just trimming the budget, it's a complete institutional overhaul.
We saw some direct casualties of this. The plan to completely dismantle the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR.
Yeah, NCAR. For anyone listening, that's basically where America's best climate models and long-term weather predictions come from.
So losing NCAR means...
It means losing decades of irreplaceable data, of institutional knowledge. It's creating a vacuum. One former scientist said the knowledge base isn't a library you could just rebuild. It's a reservoir. If you shut off the input and fire the staff, the system just runs dry.
So America's leadership in climate modeling and weather prediction is just eroding.
It's actively being degraded.
Yeah.
Even while other countries are still investing heavily in it.
So when the political system is undermining objective science, you have to wonder what's happening to objective media.
And that's where the corporate angle gets incredibly sharp.
Let's talk about CBS News and its parent company, Paramount Skydance.
Okay, so Paramount Skydance just bought the Free Press for $150 million. A new editor-in-chief comes in, and almost immediately, a 60 Minutes report that was critical of the administration's deportation policy. It gets spiked, killed.
The timing is, let's just say, highly suspect.
Very suspect. Because at the exact same time, Paramount Skydance is trying to pull off a hostile, multi-billion-dollar takeover of Warner Bros. Discovery.
A deal that needs approval from the White House.
From the very administration that 60 Minutes is supposed to be covering critically. Critics are connecting these dots very forcefully.
So the postponed story is seen as a concession?
An implicit one, yeah. On top of the explicit concessions they already made, like getting rid of diversity initiatives and appointing an ombudsman with strong GOP ties, all to smooth the path for the merger.
It's a pretty stark picture. You have a media corporation that seems willing to trade journalistic accountability for regulatory gain.
It's the same pattern. The political pressure on science is mirrored by financial pressure on journalism. In both cases, the flow of critical information gets chilled.
And the stakes are they're incredibly high. If the people responsible for holding power accountable are prioritizing their business deals over the truth, the whole foundation of transparency just crumbles.
It erodes very, very quickly.
Okay, let's pivot and look outward now. Section 3. How is state power being asserted on the global stage?
Well, the U.S. and China relationship is still the main event. It's a really complex dynamic.
I thought there was a trade détente.
There was, late in the year. But at the same time, the military and resource confrontations are getting more and more assertive.
We saw a couple of big flashpoints that really show that tension, right?
We did. First, the U.S. seized a Venezuelan oil tanker that was on its way to China. A very clear move to assert control over resources.
And second, the Taiwan weapons package.
A record-breaking one. $11 billion in U.S. weapons approved for Taiwan.
That's a massive escalation.
Unquestionably. And the sources pointed to a Pentagon report that noted a twofold increase in Chinese military flights into Taiwan's air defense zone just between 2023 and 2025.
So even as they're talking economics, the military situation is heating up fast.
In the air and on the sea, yes.
Okay, shifting over to Europe. What's the latest with Ukraine?
There's some significant political movement. Kyiv has signaled it might be open to withdrawing troops from certain areas. That's its first real, tangible move towards a compromise.
That's a big deal.
It's a huge development. But you have to look at the other side of that coin.
Which is?
Long-term preparedness. The new draft legislation in Ukraine calls for a peacetime army of 800,000 troops.
800,000. The original goal was 600,000?
Exactly. It's a massive increase. It shows that even if the fighting stops, the economic and human costs of just maintaining a state of readiness is going to be incredibly high for years.
And finally, let's look at how regulatory power is being used, especially from Europe, against big tech.
Right. This is another key trend. The Italian Antitrust Authority, the AGCM, just went after Meta.
For what?
For abusing its dominant position. They accuse Meta of excluding rival AI chatbots from WhatsApp, which is, a massive platform, the AGCM ordered them to suspend those rules immediately.
So that's Europe trying to level the playing field in the AI space.
It's a global push, really, to rein in big tech's influence, ensure some competition. It benefits consumers and smaller AI companies everywhere.
And that regulatory pressure is happening here in the U.S. too, right? Even in the EV sector.
The U.S. Auto Safety Regulator, NHTSA, just opened a big investigation into the emergency door releases on the Tesla Model 3.
A defect investigation.
Yeah, and probes like that create real market risk. They can lead to very expensive recalls and shake investor confidence in these huge sectors that have been driving market growth.
So if we try to pull all these threads together, the economy, the attacks on institutions, the global tensions, what's the big takeaway for you, the listener?
I think it's that we're living in a state of profound cognitive dissonance. The U.S. financial system is incredibly strong, but it's powered by this very concentrated AI boom that isn't being shared.
Which leads to all this economic and emotional distress for most people.
Exactly. And at the same time, the institutions that are supposed to check that power science, the media, are under a very specific targeted assault from political and corporate interests.
It all seems to come down to information, what's available and what's being hidden or just destroyed.
And that leads us to a final provocative thought. It comes from a story that seems unrelated at first, the struggle to release the Jeffrey Epstein files.
Right. The Department of Justice missed its deadline to release them.
They did. And their reason was that they're just drowning in the volume of it. They need hundreds of lawyers just to review what could be 1 million pages of documents.
It's an administrative nightmare.
A complete systemic failure. An investigator back in 2020 said it was, and I'm quoting here, basically impossible to keep track of what we're getting.
Yeah.
There was just too much stuff.
So how does this tie back to everything else?
Well, the failure to release those files because of sheer incompetence and overwhelming volume. It mirrors the purposeful dismantling of scientific data at NCRER. And it mirrors the corporate manipulation that's chilling journalism at CBS.
It's all about controlling the flow of information.
Exactly. When the systems that are meant to manage and protect information fail, whether it's by accident or on purpose, how can a democratic society possibly ensure transparency and accountability?
Especially when that information involves the highest levels of state and corporate power.
The ability to control the narrative, to control the flow of truth, that might be the ultimate form of power.
And that failure to manage truth seems like the biggest threat we're facing. Thank you for diving deep with us today.
We hope this analysis gives you a sharper lens for understanding the news that's coming your way.
Until the next deep dive, stay informed.